On election day night, November 7th, 1876, Dan Sickles went into Republican National Headquarters in New York City, hoping to hear that his party was losing the race for the White House. That's right. This lifelong Democrat wanted Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden to lose to Republican Rutherford Hayes. An unusual situation, but Dan was not a usual man. This was a man who, as a seated congressman, publicly shot and killed his wife's lover, then successfully pled temporary insanity in court. This was a shamed ex-congressman who, during the Civil War, parlayed his status as a high-profile Democrat standing with the Union into an appointment as a U.S. Army general. This was a Union general who botched it so badly at the Battle of Gettysburg that it turned out for the best. Cost him a leg, but Dan's blunder likely helped win the battle, and it made him a hero. Dan would not stand for a presidential candidate who chose not to fight, Sam Tilden, over a fellow Union general, Rudd Hayes. Thus, on election day night, his curiosity took him to Republican headquarters, and the news wasn't good. Reportedly, Tilden had 184 electoral votes, just one shy of victory. But Dan was never one to concede defeat. He asked to see the returns himself. Sitting at the chairman's desk, Dan pored over the telegrams conveying the election's partial returns from the nation's 38 states. He quickly concluded it was close but not hopeless. Snatching paper and pen, Dan scratched out 2 sentences to telegraph to Republican leaders in the 4 crucial and as of yet undetermined states of Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon. With your state sure for Hayes, he is elected. Hold your state. Looking back on that from today, how might we characterize such a telegram? Cronyism? Coercion? A perfect phone call. Meanwhile, the New York Times knocked the trend of every other newspaper across the nation to declare Tilden had not won. Instead, it declared results still uncertain while announcing Oregon, South Carolina, and Louisiana for Republican Hayes, with Florida too close to call. Florida stays on brand. It knows what's up. By mid-morning, it was clear that with 4 questionable states, the presidential election of 1876 would be the most contested in American history. And this was only the beginning. In the months to come, all 4 of these states would send multiple, conflicting sets of electoral votes to Congress. Some would see rival state governments claiming power. Meanwhile, tales of violence, murder, bribes, ballot stuffing, and corrupt election boards would all come to the fore. Amid threats of civil war, a bitterly divided Congress would have to sift through all of this incontestable evidence that the election of 1876 was the worst, most corrupt election ever, yes, even worse than our most recent elections in the 21st century. My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a professor, podcaster, and upcoming author. But whether I'm in front of the class, behind the mic, or typing at my desk, however I'm conveying history, my approach is to merge the rigorous research I was academically trained to do with storytelling. Stories let us push past 2-dimensional names and dates. I believe it's in getting to know people in the past, their quirks, habits, personalities, who they love, their favorite drink, that history comes to life. Humanizing stories allows us to understand why a given historical figure did something heroic, terrible, or compromised. More on that last point later, but basically, history without stories is forgettable. That history sucks. Let me illustrate the power of storytelling with a brief foray into US pop culture. A look at the top films from 1980 to 2020 suggests that we Americans yearn for good yarn. Be it superheroes, Top Guns, wizards, or Jedi Knights, we can't blow our time and money fast enough. We'll argue about them, buy their merch, and drop a small fortune to meet them at theme parks. I'm not suggesting that history fits a simple Hollywood hero v. villain narrative, far from it. But given our love of imperfect heroes, our tendency to pass on shining knights for the dark knight, I think it's safe to say that we like a complex 3-dimensional story. Better still if that story speaks to our current concerns and fears, and that history always delivers. Now, here we are in 2024, another presidential election year. Political passions are high, and the common sentiment is that this year's election could be one of the most consequential in our history. We're living in historic times, you might say. Well, I say we are always living in historic times. And I understand being anxious about the unknown, that's fair, but we make it worse for ourselves when we fail to recall those stories from history that show us the story ahead isn't so unprecedented. To stick with the movie analogy, maybe we haven't seen this year's film, but the genre is well established. On that note, I want to regale you with an oft-forgotten classic, the contentious, murderous, true story of the election of 1876. It's the tale of how Civil War hero Dan Sickles' election night curiosity unleashed one of the sleaziest of political fights over South Carolina's, Florida's, Louisiana's, and Oregon's combined 20 electoral votes, any one of which would secure the White House for Democrat Sam Tilden, all of which were required for a Republican Rudd Hayes victory. And by the time I am done, I guarantee that every one of you, even that group back there, will think twice before preemptively calling this year's or any future election the worst ever. Shall we then? South Carolina Democrats were determined to retake, or redeem, as they put it, the Palmetto State government from Republicans. Like Dems across the South, they were relying on the Mississippi Plan, which is well articulated by the quote, peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. Red shirts and rifle clubs served as the Democrats' unofficial muscle. They killed scores of black South Carolinians in 1876. Let me hit that again, particularly for that crowd, to make sure we know our president is not the incontestable worst. Vigilante Democrats executed unknown numbers of innocent black South Carolinians in the buildup to the 1876 vote. President Grant ended up sending 1,000 federal troops to secure South Carolina's voting process. Meanwhile, Palmetto State had a mathematically impossible 101% voter turnout. Even Chicago was like, it's a little too much voting early and voting often. After the state's unabashedly pro-Republican election board cooked the count, both parties claimed control of the state legislature and governorship. Federal troops prevented bloodshed as these opposing rival state governments both sent electoral votes to Congress, one set for each candidate. Florida's vote remained relatively peaceful, but that didn't make the post-election politicking any softer. In fact, the partisan fight over the Sunshine State's electoral votes was worse than South Carolina's because everyone knew it would be fudgedly close, and oh man, was the predominantly Republican election board ready to fudge. It tossed out every questionable Democratic-leaning precinct, but winked at many Republican-leaning precincts with known problems, including ballot stuffing. A paper trail of telegrams suggests that the Democrats tried to buy off a Republican member of the election board. This failed, not because the Republican was honest, but because the Democrats mixed up their own secret codes. Meanwhile, GOP leaders were thrilled not to have to bust out the suitcase of cash they brought along for bribes. Ultimately, the Sunshine State sent not one, like you're supposed to, not two, like South Carolina, but three. One Republican, two Democrat, 3 sets of electoral votes to Congress. And you thought hanging chads were bad. Please. Florida of 2000 was living in the shadow of its 1876 masterpiece. Nowhere was the political violence more jarring than Louisiana. Black witnesses told the state election board tales of destroyed ballots, violence, and murder. No testimony moved more than Eliza Pinkston's. She recounted a rifle club-style raid on her home in which men told her husband he would never vote Republican again, shot him dead, raped and cut her, and killed their infant. While historians question the political motives, her husband had recently registered Democrat. The violence and murder are not disputed. Louisiana's Republican-controlled election board was the most corrupt in the nation. All sorts of bribes were considered. $100,000 per board member, $250,000. The biggest figure was $1 million. I mean, go big or go home, right? Democrats considered it, but passed. But did the Republicans bribe the board instead? Circumstantial evidence that we lack the time to get into suggests that, yeah, they super did that. In the end, Louisiana's election board made partisan cuts that discounted just the right 15,000 votes to flip what was Democrat Sam Tilden's solid win to a Republican victory. Naturally, both parties claimed to win. Both parties sent electoral votes to Congress. Nor was all well in Republican-won Oregon. The issue was that an elector was also a postmaster. Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution prohibits any person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States from serving as an elector. Even at a meager $268 per year salary, the postmaster's federal job ran afoul of the Constitution. I think you can guess what Oregon did. Two sets. Thus it was that 4 states sent more than one set of electoral college returns to D.C., totaling the 20 electoral votes Hayes needed to prevail. Divided, partisan, filled with the very men who orchestrated half of the problems, Congress would have to figure out what to do with this constitutional crisis. Ultimately, Congress came up with a 15-man electoral commission, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 semi-independent thinker. Congress's vote count and this commission's role in it is a dramatic tale in and of itself, but suffice it to say that Tilden's electoral count never moved from where Dan Sickles left him on election night, 184. Meanwhile, Hayes picked up all 20 disputed votes to reach that magical winning number, 185. Many Democrats were enraged. Tilden or blood, they cried, as President Grant reinforced D.C. for a possible rifle club attack. Just how close we came to a second civil war is hard to say, but with fresh memories of the last one, a compromise emerged. Significantly, it included an end to federal enforcement of black citizenship-protecting Reconstruction policies. Democrats, including and thanks to Sam Tilden, accepted Rudd Hayes' victory. Well, legally they accepted it. The Dems still called this election the fraud of the century. The worst election ever. Many have used such language in recent 21st century elections. Many will this year. But I am baffled by such irresponsible assertions. Worse than 1876. Worse than blatantly requested, offered, and likely taken bribes. Worse than voter fraud, corrupt election boards, rival state governments. Worse than rifle clubs slaying unknown hundreds. Ladies and gentlemen, as a public-facing professor who occupies a small space in our national dialogue, please accept my apologies. While I know ardently that there are good individuals working in our government, media, and academia, if our combined efforts have allowed such unchecked hyperbole to become our national narrative, and we have, then we have failed you as intellectual, thought, and political leaders. In pursuit of higher click-through rates, easy votes, or collegial praise, we have blasphemed against the sacred trust of American citizens who look to such institutions for answers, for the voice of reason, and frankly for leadership, all of which should be a given. I'm not promising that 2024 or a future election will never be worse than 1876. I'm a historian, not a prophet. Maybe there's a scarier film yet to be made in the genre. But I do believe that 1876 can remain our lowest of electoral lows if we learn its lessons and apply them. So, 3 takeaways. 1, despite what our moms told us, we just aren't that special. Especially our problems. If we study our history, we can find comfort in the realization that many have seen worse, yet still stuck the landing. So let's cut the fatalism, crack a book, download a podcast, be the kind of informed citizens who can enjoy the privileges and bear the burdens of representative government. 2, we can't let partisan politics consume us as those in 1876 almost did. George Washington said in his farewell address that the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. He went on to warn that party tribalism agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. Well said, George. While parties do serve their purposes, history teaches us that we move forward when we keep country ahead of party. 3, demand the leadership that we deserve. Be they politicians, intellectuals, or members of the media, real leaders don't stoke our greatest fears and divide us. They come up with a game plan to win and unite us. So stop listening to those whose only answer is that the boogeyman is real and that a monster is hiding under your bed. Reject the voices of doom and gloom that threaten to lead us to an entirely unnecessary, self-fulfilling prophecy of destruction. If we do that, I think we'll find that FDR's bold words amid the Great Depression and the rise of fascism in Europe are still applicable today. My fellow Americans, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.